presentation today is entitled, Is Humanity Becoming Humankind? And in this presentation, Penelope will be exploring how we humans are progressing in the kindness state towards each other, our fellow creatures, and Mother Earth. So,
greetings everyone, and I'd like to say thank you to the Wellington branch for hosting us in this very beautiful and very special place, and thank you to Renee for inviting me to speak. The easy part was saying yes, a little more challenging coming up with something that won't send you all to sleep at this time of the afternoon. So, is humanity becoming humankind? We've all heard the expression, the milk of human kindness runs through his veins. That's an interesting saying, the milk of human kindness. Milk is the first food that humans and all mammals require for physical sustenance, just as kindness is essential psychological sustenance. I trust you all know many people who are worthy of that description. I hope we ourselves are worthy of that description. At other times we may say, she did that out of the kindness of her heart, not her mind or her brain, the heart being the centre of compassion, and kindness, of course, being the natural consequence of compassion. So to be kind, no letters are required after your name. No education at all, in fact. Every human has the potential to feel compassion and therefore allow kindness to inform their actions. We know, however, that this certainly does not always happen. We do not live in a perfect world. We are not yet fully evolved. But are we heading in that direction? As we slowly, very slowly develop to become fully human and whatever lies beyond, are we becoming kinder to each other, to ourselves, to our younger brothers and sisters, as Annie Besant liked to refer to the animal kingdom, and to Gaia, our Mother Earth? Before I speak any further, I'd just like to stress that I'm no academic researcher or scientist. The points I make are simply my own observations and conclusions, gleaned from living, watching, listening, conversing, and reading all manner of things from newspapers, magazines, novels, theosophical books, poetry, non-fiction, whatever's around to read. I hope I won't state the obvious too frequently, but I do believe that it's not a bad thing to sometimes go back to the basics and reflect. While I was preparing this little talk, a few friends asked what I was doing and what the title would be. When I told them, there were very mixed reactions. One person said, well, definitely no if you watch Al Jazeera News, which I don't. Another friend who's a great animal lover said, oh no, most people aren't really very nice, give me animals any day. Another responded with, well, that could be quite uplifting and hopeful. And yet another came up with, yes, we even have a Prime Minister now who encourages kindness. So I wonder what conclusions you good people will come to. So firstly, let's think about some everyday attitudes to societal situations and social justice issues. Kindness to one another, in other words. When I speak about us and humanity, I naturally mean all of us throughout the world. However, even though we now live in a greater global community than we ever have before in recorded history, we know that there are quite large discrepancies, socially, legally, politically, etc., between nations and cultures, and even within nations and cultures. So when I say our attitudes and ways of living, I'm referring mostly to Western-style democracies, like our own, which account for much, though certainly not all, of the world's people. And of course, it's the sort of situation that I know most about as well. So, what about single mothers, for example? For hundreds of years, if women became pregnant outside of marriage, they were forced to live a very miserable existence unless they could persuade someone to marry them or get rid of the child. They were not only shunned by most of society, but often punished as well. The men who fathered the babies were seldom held to account. This is also related to the unfair treatment of women that was prevalent for so long and is still not completely sorted. Nowadays, we look far more favourably on solo mums and dads for that matter, And the welfare of parent and child is now far more important than meting out punishment and humiliation. And what about gay people and any others with gender differences from the majority? The utter rejection of these people and the unjust cruelty towards them was the norm in most societies until really very recently. Now, for the most part, the rainbow community is just part of the wider community. Gay partnerships and even marriages are legal in many societies now. Even as short a time as 50 years ago, this would have been utterly unthinkable. People with mental and physical disabilities too are now included and catered for far more than ever before. Life can be difficult enough for our disabled brothers and sisters without the awful treatment and isolation that they once had to endure as well. The long-running TV soap opera Coronation Street, I'm a secret fan, even has a character played by a young man with Down syndrome, and he does it very well too. Now, what a change in attitude that represents. There's still some stigma attached to mental illness, but so much less, really, than in the past. Some prominent members of society have stepped up to change that perception and attitude. Treatments are kinder too. They have been fairly brutal in the past, almost sadistic, it seems. I do understand that modern medical drugs have played a role in this softer treatment, but ironically, some modern recreational drugs are responsible for much mental imbalance. Perhaps the people who deal in these hard drugs are among the least kind of our fellow beings and are responsible for a lot of harm to others. Now, racism is a big one. It's still alive and flourishing and does not involve much kindness in thought, word, or deed. It stems, as do so many acts of unfairness and injustice, from our illusion of separateness and otherness. We cannot deny, however, that the number of people who easily accept racist attitudes and behaviour has diminished. The issue is being constantly called out and addressed. I think a dark shadow is being uncovered. In my observation, many more young people barely notice someone else's race or ethnicity. Our society is becoming more beautifully cosmopolitan and blended. We should be different in appearance, in customs, in language, etc. But these differences should be embraced and celebrated. I believe, perhaps naively, that this is starting to happen. Could we, even 30 years ago, have imagined that so many people in Western cultures would help to celebrate Diwali and Chinese New Year along with Christmas and Easter? In New Zealand, we're even about to have a public holiday to mark Matariki. Punishment for crime is another area where we are now kinder to each other. The death sentence is all but gone in most Western democracies, although that is not the case across the globe, I know. But remember that once common punishments were public floggings, hangings, beheadings, and worse. Offences once considered worthy of serious punishment, like stealing a loaf of bread for your starving family, are now petty crime and treated as such. Imprisonment, your loss of personal freedom, is now deemed a punishment in itself, with no further cruelty necessary. In other words, even prisoners have rights to the basics of life, which certainly was not so once upon a time when torture and starvation were part of the punishment. Extremely inhumane treatment of chain gang prisoners was common right up until the 20th century. Are we kind to our children in these times? Well, despite the still shocking statistics relating to child abuse and intentional injury, these are mostly isolated cases. We have much room for improvement overall, but children too have rights now to protection, shelter, and education. We no longer send them up filthy chimneys or down dangerous mines, things which happened as a matter of course for many in the not-so-distant past. Even schools, which were once cruel and nasty places, are now more likely to work on the theme of a pat on the back is only inches away from a kick or a caning on the bottom, and it could have better results. Even once unrecognised qualities such as emotional intelligence and creative thinking are encouraged by some teachers now. Of course, bullying, the most cowardly unkindness, still exists today in a big way. At one time you had to confront or actually face someone to bully them. Sadly, the modern means of communication, social media, has enabled it with anonymous ease. However, where in the past it was apparently accepted and common means for people to exert their power and control over others, for example, some teachers, some bosses, or stronger children, it is no longer acceptable, and it is challenged and addressed wherever possible. Religious intolerance has been and still is one of the prime causes of the violence and cruelty that humans are capable of inflicting on their fellow humans. But even in this troubled area of human relations, there has been a tiny move in the right direction. Just baby steps, but a start anyway. Across the globe, there are interfaith groups working earnestly to help people to understand each other's beliefs and ways of worship. Within the Christian faith, long divided into different strands, hostile to one another, there is now much more cooperation, sharing, and friendship, just as Christianity should be. This happens to an extent that would horrify the likes of King Henry VIII and his daughter Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, and others who sanctioned so many vile persecutions and deaths in the name of their particular brand of Christianity. Perhaps people like the Dalai Lama and Pope Francis, both compassionate and influential religious leaders, can take some credit for the shift here. And of course, our own Theosophical Society, which, since its inception in late Victorian times, has had as its second object to encourage the study of comparative religion, science, and philosophy, the study and understanding of something, often leading to a more tolerant and accepting outlook. With reference to some of my examples about social issues, I realise it's unfair to make judgments about the past by superimposing modern thinking onto historical facts and events. The worldview, understanding, and commonly held beliefs were so very different in the past. But that is exactly my point. If the mostly held worldview and practices are leaning towards more acceptance, tolerance, and kindliness, then surely we are progressing in the right direction, and there is room for hope and reason to expect better. It goes without saying that no talk relating to compassion and kindness would be complete without some wisdom from the Dalai Lama. He has this to say, quote, "Compassion can be roughly defined in terms of a state of mind that is non-violent, non-harming, and non-aggressive. It's a mental attitude based on the wish for others to be free of their sufferings and is associated with a sense of commitment, responsibility, and respect towards others. In one sense, one could define compassion as the feeling of unbearableness at the sight of other people's suffering. In order to generate that feeling, one must first have an appreciation of the seriousness or intensity of another's suffering. So I think that the more fully one understands suffering and the various kinds of suffering that we are subject to, the deeper will be our level of compassion." Unquote. Where he speaks of that feeling of unbearableness at the sight of another's suffering, it resonates with the words of Helena Blavatsky in The Voice of the Silence, when she writes, "Let thy soul lend its ear to every cry of pain." And further on, "Let not the fierce sun dry one tear of pain before thyself has wiped it from the sufferer's eye." I worked for many years as a home care assistant with mostly elderly, infirm or disabled people. We had 4 women coordinators at one stage, and they were all very nice ladies. 3 of them had been home helps themselves, working out in the community, and they were always sympathetic and understanding towards our clients. The fourth lady had previously worked for the IRD for many years. She appeared to have a markedly different view of our clients and was sometimes slightly scathing, more or less inferring they were swinging the lead or playing the system. And then she had a fall and she broke her leg badly. For many weeks she was in plaster and she was in pain. When she returned to work, her attitude was rather different. She displayed decidedly more empathy towards our clients. It was very interesting to observe. Perhaps there's a lesson in there for all of us. When we are afflicted with pain or suffering of any sort, physical, emotional, mental, once we've pulled through it, should we take something positive from it and say, well, now I know how it feels to be in that situation. I can genuinely empathize with others who are similarly afflicted. Understand the suffering, as the Dalai Lama says. The Dalai Lama also says, quote, one of my fundamental convictions is that basic human nature is more disposed towards compassion and affection, unquote. So, is kindness our actual default setting, as it were? In times of crisis, great acts of kindness, selflessness, and charity come to the fore. It seems much more so than in normal times. Is this perhaps just a reflection of the disconnected communities we tend to inhabit in modern times, especially in very large cities? Suddenly, when there's trouble, we need to stick together and look out for one another. We have a common purpose to survive. This has been clearly illustrated through 2020, the year of the pandemic, which threatened lives and livelihoods right across the world and is still doing so in many places. Many wonderful stories of kind acts have been reported, and there are many more we shall never know about. Sure, there were those who broke the rules and those who marched and protested and shouted a lot, but they have actually been in the minority in most places. Human connection is so important to keep compassion and empathy alive and active. The COVID pandemic threatened that, yet we found, and are still finding, some are still finding, ways to connect, to help one another. We just had our own example. So again, I wonder, is the natural default position of humans centered towards kindness, or is selfishness the overriding setting? I tend to think it depends somewhat on the age of the soul residing within any particular human body. In other words, how evolved that soul is. We are, each of us, on that obligatory pilgrimage of the soul. But we are not all necessarily at the same point of travel. We fairly often hear stories of great heroism when people have given up their own lives to save the life of another, the ultimate kindness and sacrifice. Other times the rescuers survive, and afterwards they say, well, it's just what anyone would have done. I just automatically dived into the burning house or the raging water. That is absolute extreme kindness, especially when the person saved is a complete stranger. Not all of us would be able to do that. So possibly those who do are a mile or two ahead on the pilgrim path. And here's another idea. Is it sometimes easier to show kindness, especially by means of generosity, financial generosity, to absolute strangers than to those we actually know something about? And if so, is this owing to the old bugbear, judgment? I believe that much of what prevents kindness to others is judgment. Most of us are so quick to judge, it becomes a terrible habit. Naturally, there are times when judgment is necessary. For example, should I spend all that money on a new car right now? Or is it safe to allow my teenager to go to that party? But leave it out when it comes to human encounters and relationships. Discernment is a much better option. I don't need to be best buddies with everyone I meet, but I can nevertheless speak kindly, offer respect and help when possible and needed. In your own close relationships, of course, if you believe that by giving to someone you are enabling harm to them or to others, then discretion and discernment are paramount. But as my dear mother used to tell us, if you have nothing kind to say, say nothing. I've penned a few verses about judgment. If your kindness ever falters, just open your heart wide. Release the true compassion which resides there deep inside. Let judgment go, just set it free. It allows us not, with eyes of spirit, properly to see. But keep discernment ever at your side, if by the rules of highest good you would choose to abide. Remember, the kind way is the best way in every walk of life. When compassion speaks, obey. Thus keep love alive and avoid much pain and strife. So, how are we scoring in the kindness to each other stakes? Not too badly, perhaps. There's still a long way to go and much work to be done. But there is, I think, heartening progress in many areas. And Tim, interestingly, just said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You know. What about kindness to ourselves? Please be very certain that I'm not here advocating enormous self-indulgence and hedonistic lifestyle, both of which can lead to the very opposite of self-kindness. I'm suggesting that self-kindness is about self-respect and self-esteem. It's about reverence and gratitude for the physical, emotional, and mental vehicles that house the spirit, that spark of the divinity within us as it experiences life and life's lessons on the physical plane. I believe that self-kindness entails making, where possible, sensible and healthy choices about the way we live on each of those planes. For example, eating sensibly, exercising body and mind, having a balanced life. And this includes not overstretching ourselves, learning when to say no. These problems arise from an altruistic desire to serve, but they can result in not being able to deliver or causing terrible disappointment and then dealing with the feelings of guilt that follow. An attitude of gratitude is helpful in self-kindness. It's challenging on occasions not to yield to despondency when life is throwing us lemons. Make lemonade, they say. These are the very times we need to try at least to count our blessings and embrace life, to help ourselves through and allow others to help, support and guide us. Receive assistance gratefully and graciously. That way you're allowing others to serve. There are now more opportunities for us all to seek and find help when we need to. Things like, for example, post-traumatic stress syndrome are now acknowledged and able to be dealt with, and that's just one example. Perhaps then a few plus points in that subject. Now a quick look at where we are with regard to the animal kingdom. A very mixed bag of good and bad, it seems. In Western cultures, and I hope others too, we no longer countenance things like bear baiting and cockfighting and other dreadfully cruel forms of so-called entertainment. Circuses no longer parade large lions and elephants across a stage performing demeaning tricks and then transporting them around in tiny cages. Zoos appear to be far more aware of the needs and the comfort of their inmates. They sometimes rescue animals in danger, and they work towards breeding some out of the danger of extinction. However, and it is a big however, despite the wonderful work of animal charities like the SPCA and SAFE, there are still some shameful practices here in our very own New Zealand as well, involving animals. Things like rodeos, to which many people object strongly, but still they're permitted to continue. Some factory farming practices and the export of live animals by sea under awful conditions to countries whose human rights are suspect and wild animal welfare, any animal welfare, is non-existent. There are thankfully many voices and loud protest against these events now, but as yet the powers that be are deaf to them. My hope is that in future times people will look back on the live animal export ships with the same disgust with which we now view the human slave ships of the past. Many farm animals on modern farms are treated more like machines than sentient beings. In contrast, though, support for vegetarian and vegan lifestyles has increased a great deal as people become more aware of the benefits to themselves, to the animals, and to the environment. Many wild animal species have become extinct or are on the brink, owing to human population explosions, human greed, catered for often by things like poaching and overfishing, vile sports like trophy hunting. Thankfully, more tourists now choose to shoot wild animals with their cameras than with their guns. And there are also dedicated animal experts and workers endeavouring tirelessly to protect and care for animals in the wild. Sickeningly, vivisection and laboratory experiments on animals don't seem to be lessening. In fact, there are probably greater numbers than ever before as scientists try to find cures for every human ailment and even ageing and physical death. I think overall we still score pretty low marks with regard to kindness to the animals. But again, there are glimmers of hope. People like Sir David Attenborough and his delightful and enthusiastic documentaries and films have done much to educate us about the wonders of the natural world and treasuring it accordingly. Lastly, let us rate our scale of kindness to our Mother Earth, Gaia. Oh dear. I don't think that at this point in history we can claim our rating to be very good at all. In fact, it's pretty appalling. We humans have managed to pollute and plunder the oceans, the rivers, land and forests, and even the very air we breathe in an atrocious way all over the globe, and are now paying the price for it. Primitive humans lived in harmony with nature. They saw themselves as part of it, connected to it, and they lived within its laws. Since the time of the agricultural revolution, many long ages ago, humans discovered they could manipulate nature to a certain extent, grow certain crops where they chose, and breed certain animals for food. Now, for a long time, that did not appear to be too out of tune with Mother Nature's plan, not too damaging. However, some modern agricultural methods are a whole nother story. Then came human population growth, global expansion, and the Industrial Revolution, which has ultimately been responsible for so much of the pollution and damage at the same time as it has made our lives so much easier and more comfortable. Altogether a somewhat bleak picture, don't you think? But once again, hope springs eternal in the human breast. There is a ray of hope for some redemption, even in this very worrying scenario. It's taken the voices of many individuals over several decades to make some governments finally sit up and take notice, perhaps only just in time. There are now some positive steps being taken to try and reduce carbon emissions, which produce the damaging greenhouse gases. Our own government has put a ban on new consents for oil and coal exploration. There are plans and schemes for cleaning up waterways, reducing plastic waste landing up in the wrong places and thereby damaging entire ecosystems. Again, these are tiny baby steps, and we are at a crucial point. But the awakening appears to be dawning. We should be hopeful that if someone were to be giving this talk a century from now, they could say, our forebears acted just in time, and we still have a habitable planet Earth. Of course, I don't need to stress that we can all contribute to this work of kindness to Mother Earth, even in small ways of daily life, or by contributing to conservation projects of all kinds, and there are many wonderful ones doing great things. A National Geographic photographer, Amy Vitale, when organising a fundraising photography sale for Conservation International, expressed it concisely. When we see ourselves as part of nature and part of the landscape, then we recognise that saving nature is really about saving ourselves. And that, in fact, corresponds exactly with the theosophical concept of the one life in all, to which we have a duty of kindness. Towards the end of the Theosophical Classic, at the feet of the Master, the following words are to be found. But not only must you thus refrain from evil, you must be active in doing good. You must be so filled with the intense desire of service that you are ever on the watch to render it all around you, not to man alone, but even to animals and to plants. You must render it in small things every day, that the habit may be formed, so that you may not miss the rare opportunity when the great thing offers itself to be done. So in conclusion, I would like to encourage us all to perform acts of kindness frequently, daily, so that in time, kindness and empathy influence our every thought, word, and deed, thereby hastening the transformation of mere humanity into truly compassionate, human kind. Thank you.